right. Well, good evening, everyone. Hi. I think we're still letting a few more people in, but I just wanted to say happy Tuesday. So glad you could join us here today to spend a little time. I have a few opening remarks before I introduce my esteemed colleagues. So we're just going to wait and get a few more people. I see people are still connecting. So good to see all of you. I wish and long for the days where we could get together and go to the OAB and have time together. But as we're continuing to allow a few more people in, I just wish you all good health and happiness. So tonight is kind of in a tradition of higher education. And I wanted to start with a few opening remarks, and then I'll introduce everybody. You know, Mark, if you could also maybe put up the housekeeping slide, if you could right now, because this is a time where I would point out some housekeeping about silencing your phone and pointing out where the exits were, but we're not in the old administration building today. So, but we do want to come together. We value your time. So if you have any questions, you could ask a question through the chat. As you heard, as we started this conversation and this dialogue of academics and the ASG president and college president is being recorded, and we will post it on our social media sites, as you see there. And you will also notice that tonight, like all of our forums, we are so grateful to have two of our sign language interpreters, Derek and Jade, providing sign language interpreting service for us. So thank you very much. All right, Mark, you could take that down. So tonight, we are continuing kind of a tradition in academia. Throughout history, colleges have played an important part in teaching about the current political situation, the historical relevance, looking at political science, and really kind of we play a role in the health of democracy in terms of how we can be a catalyst for civic engagement, civic discourse. And of course, our primary goal is to transform lives through education and teach students about civil discourse as we teach about our history, our political science, our history of social movements. And tonight, I am joined by some really talented professors who've been doing that. You know, this institution has been serving the community for over 100 years, and while Paul and I have not been there for all 100, Paul Gilmore is one of our professors who's been teaching with us for 17 years. He went to Georgia Tech. He teaches in American history. And he and I had an opportunity to talk after the events of January 6th, talking about we are at a pivotal point nationally and culturally, and we're at an interesting point. And so kind of raise the question, what is the role of education during this time? What is our role as educators to help teach and instruct and help to have civil discourse? And so we kind of talked about the importance of knowing where we've been and where we're at, the history of it. And so when I talked to Paul about would he be interested in doing this and who else would be interested, he said, well, of course I'm interested. And then he introduced me. Well, I had an opportunity to meet Nick before. Nick Hernandez has been teaching with us for 3 semesters. Hi, Nick. He's a Fresno State grad and teaches in our political science division. So he's going to be with us sharing tonight. And then, of course, how this all came about, I want to introduce somebody. If you think about our future being bright because of our history, I think it's safe to say our future is bright because of our students. And tonight wouldn't have been possible without Yatzari Victoria. Wave Yatzari. Yatzari is our ASG student body president. And she is a remarkable young lady who came to me with this idea about we need to talk about this and why does this matter for students? This is such an important part. We're seeking truth and want to learn. We need to have this conversation. So tonight. I'm glad you could join Yatzari and I. Yatzari is a sophomore here at Fresno City College. We are so proud of her. She is on our law pathway program. So she is on the path to becoming a lawyer and maybe a legislator and a senator, who knows. And after she completes with us, hopefully she'll be going to UC Davis. Go Aggies. So again, thank you all for being here and joining myself and our interesting guests tonight. So with that, we're going to start. We did a coin toss like we do with all big things. And I believe it was going to be Mr. Gilmore. Are you going to be starting some opening remarks?
I think we said Nick.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
I got the short end of that.
Okay. All right, Nick. So how we're going to do this, just for everybody who's listening, we're going to have both of our professors give a few opening remarks, and then Yatzari is going to ask them a few questions, and I'm going to ask questions, and then you have an opportunity to ask questions as well. So that's kind of our flow for the evening. So Nick, your opening.
Well, good evening, everybody. I really appreciated this opportunity because, I mean, it comes around every 4 years. So there's a, pretty significant number of my students that never get to hear about this kind of thing. It's something we sort of take for granted, this transfer of power. But what I wanted to talk about specifically was more from the institutional or structural perspective of how we even got to the fact that we are transferring power from from one administration to another. So I want to talk briefly about the Electoral College and how that works. So, from an institutional perspective, on in November 4th, most of us went out and voted, and we went to the polls and we voted for, who we thought we wanted to be the next president. And many of you know that we're not actually voting for that person. In fact, we're voting for a group of what we call electors, who are part of an electoral college, which is, constitutional. It was created as part of the Constitution. So when we go to the polls, we're voting for this group of people that will then go on to vote essentially in our stead. So the way that this works is we have 538 of these electors in this electoral college. And the number of electors that each state receives is dependent on the number of people that are in the House of Representatives representing the state and the 2 senators. So for example, the state of California has 55 electors. So that number is determined by the fact that California has 53 representatives in the House and 2 senators. That's where we get the 55. So we add up all these electors and it comes out to 538. That's the magic number, this total of 538. So when we vote, who those electors go to, whether it would be Joe Biden or Donald Trump, is dependent upon the majority of the vote, of the popular vote in each state, right? So California, the majority of Californians voted for Joe Biden, which meant that those 55 electors would be awarded to Joe Biden. And those electoral counts would happen in December and would happen later. So 48 states have a winner-take-all system. So if you win the majority of the popular vote in the state, you get all of those electors, and those electors go to the Electoral College and vote. Maine and Nebraska do it differently. They do it proportionally. So each candidate gets some. So the way in which the electors are chosen, how they're chosen and when they're chosen and all of that, it depends on the state. So the state gets to decide. In the state of California, each political party picks 55 people to represent the Electoral College. So the Democrats would pick 55, the Republicans, the Green Party, et cetera. They pick their 55. The way that the popular vote goes in the state determines which group of those 55 goes to the Electoral College to vote, okay? So in this election, the magic number to become president, any of our elections, is 270, which is one more than half of the 535. So to become president, you need 270 electoral votes, right? One more than half, the majority of electoral votes. in this election that happened with Joe Biden and President Trump, Biden got 306, got 306 electoral votes, and Trump got 232, which was the margin that Trump beat Hillary Clinton in 2016. So, you know, I have students that talk about this every single semester because of this process, and we can get into, you know, how relevant the Electoral College is these days at another date. We can argue that later. But when it comes to, you know, students coming to me and say, well, if this is the system, if it comes down to the electoral vote rather than the popular, then why should I vote? Well, the easy answer is because your vote determines the electoral count for your state. So you vote, and that will determine the electoral count. And there was some discussion in this last election from President Trump and some of his allies about changing the quote unquote loyalty of those particular Electoral College members, changing their vote from, you know, in favor of Joe Biden and switching them to Donald Trump in those states that Joe Biden won. There are laws in some of these states that restricted that from, stopped that from happening, right? So all of this to say, the constitutional foundation of how we pick the president, the state laws that have been created over the years, that is how we have come to the fact that tomorrow we're transitioning from one president to another. It's because of that constitutional foundation. It's because of the institutions that have survived, you know, 244 years. All of those institutions, those procedures, the process, the state laws, the federal laws have created the situation that we're in, where we are transitioning from one presidential administration to another. Now, the Constitution doesn't explicitly say that there should be a peaceful transfer of power, but it's just something that we've come to expect, right? It's become what we refer to as an institutional norm. It's this pattern of behavior that happens over and over and over again, so that every 4 years we expect this to happen. We expect this transition to happen. You know, President Trump not attending the inauguration tomorrow, that's not constitutional. It's not something he has to do, but it's a tradition that we've come to expect, right? The former First Lady inviting the newly minted second gentleman to the White House is not constitutional. It's something that we've come to expect. Or the First Lady inviting Dr. Biden, Jill Biden, to the White House is not constitutional. It's something we've come to expect. So when these institutional norms are questioned, then in the process by which we choose who is in power, when that is questioned, that's when we start to examine the role of the institutions and the strength of those institutions. That's where it can become detrimental to the democratic process. So these election laws and the institutions that have created the process of transference of power from one to the other, there are even challenges to that. There are court challenges that candidates are afforded, and something the Trump administration had done as well. Something like 80 lawsuits were filed challenging the outcome of this process. All of that was done on purpose, right? The framers of the Constitution understood that there was going to be some conflict happening. They understood that there was going to be disagreements. And this is when the Constitution was written, is an age in which the political parties didn't exist, but they still understood that conflict would happen. And so this is the process to resolve that conflict. Have a free and fair election. This is the process. This is how you determine electoral accounts. This is the laws that are put in place give states some authority to write laws about elections as well. This is the process. There's going to be a winner and there's going to be a loser. If you follow the process, things will transition smoothly. An election occurred. There is a winner and now there is a loser. We may have disagreements, but this is the system that we have, and it's worked up until this point. And so we continue to do it. It becomes institutionalized over and over and over again. So they understood that there may be conflicts. They set up a system to allow this system to be resolved, that conflict to be resolved within. So this transition of power in this way is both sort of symbolic and practical. It's symbolic in that the loser of the election steps aside and allows for the winner to take his or her place, as it were, right? So that's sort of the symbolic part of it. They understand that they've lost the election, but they want to unify behind the new administration, and literally stepping aside to allow the new president to take the oath of office. In the practical sense, that transition is important because it's not as though President-elect Biden tomorrow, right after the swearing in, he doesn't start the job just then, right? There's this whole weeks-long transition so that President-elect Biden can start immediately. So that transitionary period, that's the practical part of it. We're right in the middle of this horrendous pandemic, and that transitionary period, access to information, access to resources is really, really important. That practical part of it didn't exist until the early 1960s with a piece of legislation that was passed by Congress to allow these newly elected individuals to have access to those resources. So, 1 second after they take the oath, they're ready to go. And that's why this period is really important for those out there that voted for Joe Biden, who wanted Joe Biden's policies to be implemented. It is done quickly. That's what they're consistently talking about, the first 100 days of an administration. Those policies can't be implemented if that transition doesn't run smoothly. That's it for I apologize if I went over my time there.
No,
I'm a
Nick,
political science instructor, so I get all heated about this stuff.
No, Nick, you did great. You followed the rules of how we're going to run this. And then if any of you who are listening have any questions, please send them in the chat and they'll go to the co-host and we will ask. So that was your opening remarks. And then we're going to go to Professor Gilmore for opening remarks. And then we have some questions from our ASG president. So Professor Gilmore.
All right. Thank you. Thanks to you, President Goldsmith, and you too, President Victoria. I really appreciate you inviting me to participate in this. So I've been asked to give a kind of little historical perspective on these recent events and what our history might have to tell us about the transfer of power in America. And I appreciate Nick in sort of setting us up there with the sort of structural story. I kind of want to talk a bit about how the events of 2 weeks ago and really of the last couple of months are kind of a break, more than kind of a break from that tradition. I've also been asked to say a few words about how we got here, to this moment in our history where a group of angry supporters of one candidate after the election would storm the Capitol to stop the workings of the government and the certification of that election. But maybe we can talk a little bit about the how we got here in our question and answer thing. Well, what Nick was explaining, is that, we've had this form of government here for some 230 years. So perhaps I think we can be forgiven if we take the peaceful transfer of power for granted sometimes. But I'd say that if there's a silver lining to the events of the last several weeks, it's that we've been forcefully reminded that there's nothing inevitable about a peaceful transfer of power. These are these norms that we've built over the time, as Nick suggested, but there's nothing inevitable about it. This is good to remember. When one political party is defeated, it chooses to hand over power to the other. It chooses to recognize the result of an election. It chooses not to resort to violence or to encourage its supporters to do so. We've been used to this, but it's always been a choice. And we got a sobering reminder, I think, 2 weeks ago of what happens when a political party, if only a portion of that political party, and if only for just a moment, chooses not to recognize that. Now, I'm not going to go through a whole long history of elections in here. Instead, I'd like to make some basic points about our history and a couple of elections, and hopefully they'll be useful in kind of our attempts to understand this current moment. First, though, I'd like to point out that divisiveness by itself, I mean, this is, you know, where I'm coming from here, and hopefully the history that I talk about will make this clearer. But the divisiveness by itself is not really what our problem is, I would argue. We often make the mistake of looking back at our history through some kind of rose-colored glasses and nostalgically recalling a time when we were all united and we weren't so divided. But then we historians always have to rain on that parade. We always come in and say, well, no, it's more complicated than that, right? I would caution against that, folks. While some moments in our history seem less divisive than others, there have always been crucial, really important, crucial political differences in America. And I would argue even irreconcilable differences, but we remain one country. So throughout our history, Americans have been divided, and often divided on core issues and principles. These aren't just mere disagreements. The reason why I'm pointing this out is that this doesn't have to be a bad thing. Nick was talking about the conflicts that these norms help to, if not resolve, help to at least channel into political debate through these institutions. But there's a difference between real sincere divisions and the refusal to recognize the results of an election, I would argue, right? We historians, when talking about this peaceful transfer of power from one party to another, we always go back to our first such election in 1800, our first in which anything resembling parties were vying for power. This election pitted John Adams against Thomas Jefferson, and it was a really rough campaign. Negative politics, divisive politics. This is nothing new. Jefferson won the election. And with him, the Jeffersonian Republicans defeated this other party, the Federalists. Neither of these parties exist anymore in their form. In their press, though, during that election year, the Federalists had presented the potential victory of Jefferson as just a horrifying thing. Jefferson's victory, I've got it written down here, Jefferson's victory would mean, quote, dwellings in flames, hoary hairs bathed in blood, female chastity violated, children writhing on the pike. Literally, I mean, this is in their newspapers. This is what's going to happen if we elect Jefferson, this atheist in religion, this fanatic in politics. And the Jeffersonian Republicans came back with, Adams is just insane. Adams is liable to paroxysms of rage. Adams, his head, he's a monarchist. His head is so filled with queens and kings that it's more filled with kings and queens than a pack of cards, right? Yet when they lost, the Federalists peacefully handed over the reins of power. Now, take our History 11 class, it's a little more complicated than that, but they peacefully handed over the reins of power. Did they all of a sudden start loving Jefferson? Did they all of a sudden stop their opposition to Jefferson's policies? No. No, but they did so, they maintained their opposition with the understanding that such opposition would still be under the kind of this umbrella of the Republic, with the understanding that through political debate, through discourse, through political organizing, they might be able to regain power someday. And this brings me to another point, I would argue here. Just as being a divided country is not necessarily bad, unity is not necessarily the solution to our problems. We don't necessarily all have to agree, right? Unity can sometimes mean a real stifling kind of conformity that forces citizens to choose between their own consciences and submission to the prevailing kind of consensus. Unity can sometimes mean the abandonment of principles. It can be an abdication of real moral responsibility to stand up for what you believe in. And in a way, there's a historical event that kind of fits in with this sort of story too, and that would be the election of 1876. Here we have a really divisive election, another one where folks are really divided. Only 16 years after the election of Lincoln, which, if you recall, prompted the southern states to refuse to submit to that transfer of power. They said, no, we're not going to, and we're going to fight a civil war instead. Well, in 1876, the Republicans, the party of Lincoln, they've been ruling the nation since the Civil War. They're in an incredibly close election against the Democrats, and the electoral votes are disputed. Of course, Florida's involved, and South Carolina and Louisiana. Threats of violence are made, and in the end, they compromised. And we always talk about this as the Compromise of 1877. But we run into a problem here, though, sometimes, folks, in that morality play that historians sometimes narrate here. We typically tell this as a good story, a compromise to save the Union. Unity wins out over divisiveness. But sometimes we have to look at the cost. What was the cost here? Well, the cost was the Republican agreement to pretty much abdicate their responsibility to protect the rights of Black people in America, especially the 4 million freedmen, people who had been freed from slavery just a dozen years earlier. They abandoned the Black population, or began the process of abandoning the Black population of the South to this newly empowered white Southern Democratic Party, which turned around and took the vote away from Black people and imposed upon them 100 years of Jim Crow segregation. Now, I'm not saying that in 1877 we should have fought another civil war or something like that. I'm just saying that in their efforts to promote that kind of unity over divisiveness, the Republicans really abandoned a kind of principle back then. So what does this all have to do with this moment? I think one of the great lessons to be learned from our history and this story of this peaceful transfer of power isn't, I hope I've made it clear, isn't a story where we all have to embrace unity no matter what the cost is. The story, I think, is, and getting back to what Nick was saying about these institutions, is that if we accept this basic umbrella of that republic, we can have a peaceful transfer of power in which people can still disagree. People can still disagree vigorously. They can protest and engage in other forms of political activity to try to transform that government in a different way. But it's all within that umbrella of that larger republic, despite those disagreements. It's within that civil society, that umbrella of that republic, that we can even have those disagreements. Without that larger thing, I think it's much more difficult to fight in a non-violent way for what we believe in. And so in a way, I'm not happy about what happened 2 weeks ago, not at all, but it is hopefully a good reminder about the preciousness of what we do have when it comes to this process of peacefully transferring power. I don't know if I went over, I guess maybe maybe I went on a little long, but that's basically my 2 cents here. And then I'm really looking forward to our conversation, if you have any questions or anything.
All right, thank you, Paul. That was really good, and thank you, Nick. So as of for the students' questions, so in our recent elections, we hear a lot about voter fraud and voter suppression. So for my question is, historically, how does this affect our election?
Well, I think one of the things to remember, and then Nick can maybe jump in too on this one, but I think one of the things to remember here is that we kind of shorthand talk about our country as a democracy. But really, our democracy in this country is about 55 years old. My parents were adults and had been voting for a while when we finally got something approaching a democracy in this country. 1965 is what I'm talking about, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I think if we start with that basic recognition that democracy is fairly new in this country and it's fragile, then we should, then that will help us take really seriously efforts to suppress the vote, efforts to suppress people's rights to vote through all sorts of legislative shenanigans, whether it be a 2013 court case that declares unconstitutional a portion of that 1965 Voting Rights Act, or whether it's other kinds of efforts. One of the things to remember too is that those acts that were passed way back in the late 19th century to disenfranchise African Americans, none of those acts said in the 1890s in Mississippi and Alabama and South Carolina, none of those acts that had the effect of disenfranchising people of color in the South said, we're doing this to disenfranchise people of color. None of them mentioned color, yet everybody knows what it was about. And so I think that kind of history encourages us to be really vigilant, I think, about contemporary efforts to suppress the vote. I'm sorry, maybe Nick has something to add here. I'll shut up.
Well, yeah, and I was just going to sort of speak to this idea of election fraud, because it's sort of used so much that the meaning of the word is irrelevant. Anything could be considered fraud, I suppose, but that term fraud and claiming fraud is something that legislatures have used for years and years and years in order to enact legislation that makes it more difficult for people to vote. So they'll claim fraud where there may not be any fraud, or it's very, very, very rare. But they say, well, in order to combat fraud, we have to implement laws that might disenfranchise people, like voter ID laws, or even, as we've learned in the most recent elections, they're closing down polling places in different towns because they argue there's just not enough voters to rationalize having more than one polling site. Well, if you don't have a car or don't have a driver's license, you don't have access to public transportation, that makes it difficult for you. So they're not saying outrightly, like, we don't want you to vote. They're just making it really difficult to allow you to vote. And so using that term fraud, there's fraud, therefore we have to put these things in place. We've seen this for years and years and years. And so it shouldn't surprise anybody that these state legislatures, the state governments, are implementing these types of legal maneuverings just to make it more difficult. As Paul was saying, they're not going to come out and say, we don't want people to vote. They're just going to make it very difficult for certain groups of people to actually get to the polls and vote.
If I can maybe jump in with one more little comment on that, there's I forget the guy's name. This author, Walter Karp. He said, look, the only people who want everybody to vote are the American citizenry. The political parties want their members to vote. And so in our history of vote, everybody claims they want everybody to vote, but what they want, the people they want to vote, are those who are going to vote for them. And so those people with a real serious interest in everybody voting is the American people in general. And sometimes we kind of forget about that obvious statement. Anyway, enough of that.
No, thank you, Paul. That's a really good point. And I think that's also kind of about why we're here tonight. Part of our role in community colleges is to help educate our community about our history, so we'll be more aware and more educated populace. So, Nick, one of the questions, and I did get a question from Brianna Wilson that I'll ask here in just a minute, so hold on, Ms. Wilson. Nick, there's been there was a lot of media hype around what happened in Georgia. Specifically as it relates to political science. I know you wanted to have a few comments about the unique situation that we found ourselves in Georgia. So let's expand on that a little bit, would you?
Sure. So as many of you know, there was a runoff election in January. In November, the Senate candidates in Georgia, none of them received enough votes essentially to be declared the winner the night of the general election. So they had this runoff election. And so this is, Republican senators, incumbent senators facing off with two Democratic challengers. and the Democrats pulled off an upset, an electoral upset. And, you know, once again, there's all this discussion that there's no way these Democrats could have won in, you know, blood red Georgia, and this Republican stronghold of Georgia. How did these Democrats do it? They must have cheated, or there must have been fraud, because that is the only way they could. But if you sort of dig into the numbers and the statistics, that one of the factors in the Democrats winning those two Senate seats were in large part because of the Black vote and because of the young people of color vote. I mean, young people of color in the state of Georgia put John Ossoff and Pastor Warnock over the top, as it were, in many respects. I have some numbers here. 280,000 voters under the age of 30 voted before election night, which was a record in the state of Georgia. It was the highest level of voter turnout for young people in just, you know, a dozen states that keep track of this stuff at the time. There's a lot of the numbers for many of the states in the general election, they're still sort of coming in, but one of the highest turnouts in terms of, especially a runoff. There's runoff elections tend to not bring people out, especially if there isn't sort of a higher profile individual like the president on the ballot. So this election upset by the Democrats was really fueled by young people who either hadn't voted before ever, or didn't vote in the November election because they weren't of age. It was fueled by young, enthusiastic people of color, young voters who were very enthusiastic. And the interesting part about how they got to this sort of victory was because it wasn't an accident. It wasn't something that's happened. It's something that Democrats in the state have been pushing for, namely Stacey Abrams, who many people are familiar with, have been working for a decade to try and flip this state from red to blue, and with the help of these young voters. It's such a large, and will continue to be a large percentage of the overall electorate, which means that young people, not just in the state of Georgia, but all over the country, have a ton of political power because of the sheer number between Gen Zers and millennials, and then the alpha generation coming up. I mean, that's a massive, massive group of young people that really, you know, have a ton of power, but you only have that power if you use it. It doesn't do anything for you if you're sitting on your hands on election day. 1 in 5 voters in the state of Georgia were 18 to 29-year-olds who did not vote in the general election. 1 in 5, 18 to 29-year-olds who didn't vote in the general. That's a significant amount of people that came out and voted. And the brilliance of it is the fire was lit on social media platforms like TikTok. There are TikTok influencers who would spend hours promoting and getting people registered and telling people to vote. People, you know, 18-year-olds with millions of followers telling those millions of followers why it's important to vote. And, you know, the victories were like 40,000 or 50,000 votes above, you know, the incumbents. That's significant. And again, this is why you should vote, because it is directly, you know, your vote is going to matter in situations like this. That vote directly matters when there's such a, you know, a close election, and especially for young people who have that electoral power because of the size of that particular generation. So it's really interesting what happened in Georgia, and sort of the speculation is in states like Georgia that are sort of turning purple, that will continue to happen because of young voters, which is really exciting for people in our profession, really exciting.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. So I guess our next question is from Brianna Wilson, and her question is, how does this election compare to Bush versus Gore?
Bush versus Gore, 2000. Yeah, yeah, this was one of those things that when it happened, I had started teaching already, and I would always talk about how there are these hypotheticals where you could imagine a situation where somebody who didn't get the popular vote victory would win the electoral vote, or that the electoral vote would put somebody over the top. But that never happens anymore, is what I used to say. Now I say, well, it always happens, it seems. I mean, we're so close. But Bush versus Gore, I think the comparison here is kind of interesting. Some of you might not remember this, or I'm sure a lot of you don't remember this. Probably some folks weren't even alive at the time. But what happened was, it was a really close election. Gore won the popular vote. Bush and Gore came very close. You know, it was a really, really close election in Florida, and whoever would get those electoral votes would win the election. And we're talking just a few hundred votes between the two. You know, so this was a big fight. Almost immediately, the count, there was a kind of recount that was going on, and it was shut down. They were canvassing the votes, and it was shut down by a group of folks in Miami-Dade County. And so there was a little bit of that kind of, I would argue, I mean, 20 years in hindsight, there was a bit of intimidation that was going on, which was quite unfortunate. But in the end, the Supreme Court ruled for Bush, basically saying that the recount of the entire state of Florida would have to stop, and that Bush would get the election. Now, here's a perfect example of kind of what I was talking about. Frankly, I'll just be very straightforward and personal here and let my own political beliefs on the, you know, out to the whole crowd here. I didn't like that decision. I thought it was a bad one. I thought it was a really, really poor one. But then we think about the alternative. I mean, you know, there is a point at which you have to look at that and say, okay, well, that's the decision that ended up being made. That was sort of the end point. Al Gore conceded the election. They handed the reins of power over, and the anger that I felt, the disappointment that I felt, then is, you know, the idea here is to then channel that into political organizing, your own kind of organizing where you think you can do the most good, not just electorally, but elsewhere in the society too. That's the kind of channel. What's the alternative? Picking up some guns and breaking into the Capitol? And trying to stop that. That's it's in other words, I think there's a good lesson of real serious, and I would argue legitimate, anger over how that election turned out in 2000, but then also how we still, in spite of that, had a peaceful transfer of power. I don't know if that answers the question, or is there some kind of particular part of that story you would like me to flesh out some more? But that's what I've got.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Professor Gilmore. You know, a couple of questions coming in. I'm going to kind of summarize. I know Joanna had asked a question about, you know, has it always been, you know, you talked a little bit about the history, Professor Gilmore, and Nick, I'd like you to join in too, Professor Hernandez. You know, has it always been this divisive? Has it always been this distrust about the election process? And maybe if you could both talk a little bit about the election process and the level of mistrust here, historically.
Do you want to go first on that one, Nick?
Well, historically was the word used, so that automatically disqualifies me. But I will say this, in sort of recent history, I suppose, the distrust is fueled by the people in power. You know, when Obama was elected in 2008, there was a question about, at first, was he even qualified to be president because of the conspiracy theory about, you know, the birtherism thing. Was he even born in the United States, right? So So there are people to this day who don't think he's an American citizen. So they argue that there's no way he could have won because he's disqualified himself because he's not actually an American. And that speaks to this idea of the other. Somehow they're people of color or don't belong in these spaces, as it were. So that fuels distrust. And this idea of questioning elections is nothing new. Certainly over the last 20 years, it's not anything new. In 2012, when Obama was reelected, then private citizen Trump tweeted he was thinking about running for president and tweeted out that election was fraudulent and was stolen from the people. And that creates distrust. And if you aren't questioning that as an individual, if you're not, maybe these claims are inaccurate, if you're not doing that, then you assume that it's correct. And so when the outcome of, say, the Georgia special election turns out the way that it does, then you say, well, they've been telling me that these elections are fraudulent, that they're fixed, that they were stolen, and here's the outcome. See, you can see it, they won, therefore it must be fraudulent. So this is in 2014, there was a Justice Department investigation into voter fraud, all of which contribute to this questioning of the process. And certainly there are, in every election, there are cases of fraud. I don't know what the statistic, it's like you're more likely to die from being hit by lightning than find, voter fraud on any sort of scale. I don't know if that's a true statistic, but it's something like that, right? And so, well, of course it doesn't happen to the tune of like 8 million people. Or in 2016, when President Trump lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton by 2 million votes, the rationale behind that, or the reasoning was, well, 2 million people must have voted illegally. That must have been the reason why President Trump. And so if you're a supporter of President Trump, then you say, well, that must be the reason because he's telling me this is the reason. But if there isn't any sort of follow-up to that, well, maybe I should investigate whether or not 2 million people voted illegally. No one in the states have said there's 2 million, fraudulent votes. It's similar to what happened in the election in November. These state leaders are saying that this didn't happen, it didn't happen, it didn't happen. But again, it doesn't matter at that point. People are going to believe what they're going to believe, and that that distrust will continue to grow. I mean, it's something that has been perpetuating forever and ever and ever. Certainly in the last 20 years that this, and Paul can speak to, further back than that, but it's nothing new. Being educated and informed about how the process of voting works is really important, or how the process of a polling station works. As someone who's worked in a polling station for 12 hours on election day, you understand how the process works and how you go about getting people their ballots counted and all the rest of it. But you don't understand the process, then you assume things that are done in that process are wrong or fraudulent.
Yeah, I think if I would add to this, I would go back to this idea of how, have we always been so divisive? I would argue that sometimes in our past, when historians talk about particular eras, they'll talk about certain eras as more divisive than others. But one period that we talk about as a time of real consensus in American history is the 1950s. This was a consensus era. And the way I look at it is, all right, well, from whose perspective is this a consensus era? I would hope that there would have been much more divisiveness in the kind of politics that existed there. I mean, we still had Jim Crow, we still had an enormous amount of, real issues that needed to be brought up and discussed, but weren't. And so the divisiveness part of it, I'm not as worried about. A vibrant debate about where the country is going is a great thing, I think. I think what has happened maybe in the last 30 years, and maybe with 20 more years hindsight, we'll be able to see it a little more clearly. But what has happened in the last 25, 30 years, and perhaps with the rise of social media in recent decades, is a kind of almost separate reality that has happened, separate realities that have happened, that have been created, where people are in their own sort of Facebook silo or their Twitter silo, and they're in these, we talk about them a lot, these echo chambers that feed a kind of narrative that sometimes is utterly absurd. You know, the joke in recent weeks about, you know, a certain number of people in America believing in lizard people. You know, this is, we laugh about this, but this is disturbing. If we can't start out with reason as a kind of base in which we're going to have an argument, if we can't even accept basic understood facts, then we are in real trouble. We've got a real problem, and I think social media feeds into that. And I wouldn't want to go back to a time when we only had 3 TV channels and all of that kind of stuff. But there is something to be said about everybody being kind of on the same page. If you don't accept some basics about reason and rational debate, you're kind of in trouble as a republic. So that's what I would worry a little bit more about, the inability to just recognize what is true. Anyway.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Professor Gilmore and Professor Hernandez, for your words and for participating. And thank you everyone who came. And, you know, Fresno City ASG hopes to, in the future, to have events like this. And thank you to everyone who did come and everyone who helped set everything up. Thank you.
And thank you, Yatzari, for bringing this idea. And see here we had a comment from Jewel Riversmith, who is one of our outstanding classified professionals. Thank you, Jewel, for being here. And I'll get to that in just a second. But I did want to remind everybody here, you know, the role that Fresno City Colleges has played over the last 100 years in this community, and that all community colleges play in terms of making sure that the health of the democracy is vibrant by helping to educate and inform and have civil discourse. I mean, that's kind of what we're about. As you heard tonight from our 2 esteemed professors, Professor Hernandez and Professor Gilmore, America's not always gotten along, and that's okay. There's just a way to go about to have those conversations. And I hope tonight you're as inspired as I am about our future, noting that we have students like Yatzari who want to have the courageous conversation. And at one point, over 90 people came out on a Tuesday evening to listen about our history and our political past. And so going to Jewel Riversmith's question, and we're going to spend a few minutes, but this is a teaser, so this is perfect. She had asked about if Nick and Paul could speak briefly on the influence of social media and websites like social media about the political health. And it's interesting, you know, Yatzari talked about a future event. We are planning right now a future event like tonight with some of our professors in communications, and maybe even psychology or marketing, to talk about the role of social media in politics. So we're going to continue that conversation, but maybe just quick soundbite from Nick, and then one for Paul, and then we'll wrap up. Nick, you're first.
Yes, this is the influence on politics by social media. This is my academic interest. It has been for years. I remember speaking to a group of students way back in 2007 or 8 about how instrumental Facebook was going to be in politics. And I got laughed at by not just the students, but the instructors who were sitting in on the discussion, because they thought there's no way this isn't an actual platform. Now it's become the free speech platform of the 21st century. And that's it, you know, it's such a massive conversation to have, you know, the role of social media, the responsibility of social media. And right now the the sort of raw power of social media's influence in political decision making. It's very, very interesting.
Thank you, Nick. Paul, a few words.
I would reiterate the same thing. I do the history of technology, and if there's one thing that you can see across time, it's that new technologies very often reinforce the power of those who already have power, unless some other kind of change happens. And you can kind of see that with the rise of social media and Facebook. I wouldn't say it's an unalloyed good or an unalloyed bad. There's all kinds of things to consider. But one of the things I would hope people remember, that even though you use Facebook or Twitter or TikTok as a tool, you have to remember that you're the product. That you and your use of that device is the product that the owners of that product, the owners of Facebook and so on, are selling to advertisers. And to always keep that in mind when we're talking about civic engagement and so on, there is this other imperative that's going on that might distort what you're seeing, who you're arguing with, who you're agreeing with, and so on. And so that's always something to always keep in mind. And I'm sure in another panel discussion later on in the term, as you suggested, Dr. Goldsmith, folks will get into that a heck of a lot more. So
we
anyway.
will get into it, because that's what we do here at Fresno City College. We're not fearful or shy about having courageous conversations. I want to thank again Professor Hernandez and Professor Gilmore, and of course Yatzari. Thank you for being here. There's a few more words of gratitude I'd like to give out before we end our time here. I would like to thank Chris Monahan Brimmer and Kathy Bonilla for getting the word out, and thank all of you for joining us tonight. I'd also be remiss if I didn't thank the Dean of the Social Studies Division, Sherilyn Krill Hornsby, for helping to put on tonight's event in short notice, I might add. And then, of course, our interpreters, Jade and Derek. Thank you for helping us bring voice. I really appreciate you being here. And then, of course, Mark Tabay, who is the wizard behind all of these Zoom meetings. We will continue the conversation. For those students who are here, I also want to remind you, if you're not taking a full load, February, we have more classes starting. So there's an opportunity for you to take a class with professors, just like Nick and Paul tonight. You have something to learn for everyone. We'll have classes starting in February and classes starting in March. This pandemic is not going to stop us from keeping our efforts to transform lives through education. So with that, thank you all so very much. We look forward to our time again. Stay safe, practice social distance, keep your mask on, be healthy, everyone. Thank you and good night.